Are we on, John? Yeah. No? Yeah, he just.
Okay, very good. So,
Okay, those of us are gathered here. Yeah, wow, there's lots of people in the back there. Yeah, for those of you that don't know, my name is Jens Wennberg. I think everybody here knows me in some way or another. And my interest, I was asked to talk a little bit about elder wisdom, whatever the hell that is, except that it involves being old, and I think that's there. So what I want to talk about for me is choosing the other road. I have not followed in the basic road. I seem to be going other places as we go along. So to put it all in perspective, I think the big thing of my taking the other role is just a few years ago, I was working in New York City at Harlem Hospital, treating people with HIV. And my mentor said to me, Africa is dying. The people are dying of HIV, and now there's medicine available, and they need help. And a normal doctor can go into Africa for 2 weeks, but then they have to go home to their practice. You're now retired. You're to go to Africa. A couple of months later, we got a call in late August saying that in October we were to be in Durban, South Africa. Nancy and I were to be there to help what we could do to help Africa. And so there I am. We have said, what are we supposed to do? I have no idea what we're supposed to do. Neither one of us did. So we went, we jumped in, and there we were again on another road, on another path than the one you normally take when you retire. It was not going and sitting in a rocking chair. I guess for me, one of the things, I've looked at this thing, and I think I remember how all of this started. When I was 8 years old during the Second World War, we lived in Alexandria, Virginia, and my best friend from Missouri lived in Silver Springs, Maryland. So I was 8 and he was 9, and our parents said, why don't you go into Washington? So we each took a bus into the center of Washington, D.C. on a Saturday morning, met where the two buses came together, and we spent the day. And I look back on that and think, look at what's happening in these days. Could you imagine sending your 8 or 9-year-old into New York City? It was exactly the same thing. And so there we were. We're living off a very different path. Yeah. When I was 17, and the numbers make some sense, I started engineering school. And my goal was then to go ahead and be a manufacturing executive. And so I did that, and came here to be at Therm Incorporated, and then later at Singer Sewing Machine in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And while I was there, I took encounter groups. Those were popular at that time. Some of you, the older ones, remember that. They were a group therapy, I guess you would call it, but it was another way of being. It was you were in a group where you had a chance to be who you wanted to be, not who you were in the past. And I went through this, and I decided that I didn't want to devote my life to a corporation. And so at 37, I dropped out. I became a hippie. I moved back up to the land here, came back to Ithaca, built on a house. I had 2 children that I had to support. I had agreed to support them while I was an engineering executive. And so I had to do this now that I was a hippie. And what I did then was I found a method of employment. I started making brooms. And so making brooms, and eventually why I was able to support my 2 children and continue on with life. During that time, I also met Nancy, and she and I got together, and we were in Sarasota at the first Reagan recession, and we couldn't make the booth fees. There was no sales. But she went over and saw these people making wind chimes. And she said, they look good, but they're awful. They didn't do a good job. So we did. We started making wind chimes. So that was one of those things that we did. We made wind chimes. Eventually, we had 5 employees. We were incorporated. We had 200 shops across the country that were selling our chimes. And we got bored. So what were we going to do? It seemed like it was time to give back. We had had a good life. We were doing well. But it was time to give back to the community. And so we looked at the idea, maybe we should go. We were talking about going to Nicaragua and working up in the mountains, Nancy doing healthcare because she was a nurse practitioner, and I, as an engineer, would do, normal things like building water supplies and so forth. And my mother died, and it was a year from hell. My daughter-in-law got kicked in the head by her horse, and nothing worked. And so that went away. And a couple of years later, things started to being better. And I realized that what really mattered was health care. And so without telling Nancy, I applied to PA school to be a physician assistant. And lo and behold, I got accepted. Here I am. I'm 57 years old, and I'm starting medical school. The question that the director asked me, can you keep up with all these youngsters, 20s? And I said, I think I can. I'd like to try. So at 57, I did. I went there and did my various rotations. I was looking at the idea that I was going to treat tuberculosis with the Lakota Nation. I had a connection with them and with tuberculosis because my granduncle died of tuberculosis, and I have been infected. So I've taken medicine for that. So this was what I was going to do. And so this was my plan. Every time we had to write a paper, it would be something on tuberculosis. And then I did my rotation in clinical medicine. It was in January, and I did this, and I saw various people and so forth. And we had this patient who was brought in. He was found wandering on the streets of New York without any clothes on. We brought him in. We cleaned him up. We looked at his arms and we saw tracks. And we said, looks like heroin. And looking at him and the fact that he was just wandering around, it looked like AIDS dementia. that the virus had gotten him, destroyed his mind, and he was walking around. So it was one of these things. We knew that he was on the path toward death. He had very few T cells left. But we made him comfortable and so forth. And I noticed that coming to see him, he was a scraggly looking guy, was this young woman who was impeccably dressed, very much in good clothes and so forth. And I talked with her and found out that she was an administrative director of a big law firm in New York City on Wall Street. And so I looked for a black woman to make that path to that point of being that far in advance was really something. And so I was very impressed by this. I tried to get her to test to see if she was positive for HIV, and she didn't want to have anything to do with that. Anyhow, my rotation finished on Friday, and the next day, Saturday, I didn't feel done with it, so I went in to check all of my patients to see how they were doing, whether any of them had died, because that was something I confronted all the time. And as I walked down the hallway, here was the wife, and she was with these two farmer couple. Looking at him, you could see he was in a coat and a dress shirt and probably had a tie on, and you know he didn't do that regularly. He was a farmer from South Carolina, maybe a sharecropper. I don't know if he had any line. His wife was dressed in her Sunday go-to-meeting clothes too. And so they were there, and so I spoke with the wife, and she said, they haven't seen their son in 6 months. She said, will you talk with them afterwards? So I gulped, and I said, okay, I'll do that. So as they went in to see him, she turned and went the other way to the elevator and got out. She fled. She didn't want to be around them. So I got a treatment room, another place aside, and got some Kleenexes and so forth. And so when the couple came out absolutely devastated, they went in there and I started to tell them about the HIV virus and how that had affected their son and and how it was going. And she cried. And Dad even had some tears that came through. It was an incredible passage for them, the fact that they saw this, they saw their boy, and they knew that their son was dying. So after a moment, Mom took out her purse and took out a photograph. It still affects me. She took out a photograph and she showed me his picture in dress blues, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. He had gone from that farm of knowing nothing with all of the things and had become a leader, just like his wife had. And he had gone to NAM and he had picked up a habit. And he came back like lots of other vets did. And there he was dying. His parents took him back to South Carolina to die. And I spent the next 20 years of my life treating HIV. Tuberculosis was gone. Yeah, so I did. I because I had gone to Harlem Hospital for my training, I was in a minority program. That's the minority. My skin was white. All of my fellow students were black. They were African Americans. Most of them had ridden the bus, as they said. They had worked as EMS people, and so they had learned, and so that's who we were, and we learned how to do this. And because I had the place in this system, I took a seat in the thing. I felt I needed to give back to the community, so I worked at Harlem Hospital, and I worked at Harlem Hospital treating people with HIV. And those were in the days when there was nothing to treat. There was no medicine. AZT had come up, but that was just, it didn't matter. You gave it, but the virus quickly developed a way of getting around it. And so people would get that way, and they would get worse, and I would see them, and I tried to protect them against opportunistic infections, and they would get them, and they would go in the hospital, and then they'd come out, and they'd see me again, and then into the hospital, and out, and back and forth until the time they didn't make it out. And I see someone that don't know those. So I lost a patient a week. Each week I would have somebody that would die. One day I had 3, and I was a basket case. And in that time, we lived in New York City, but this was my church. We came up here every month or every 6 weeks, and we'd sit over here in a pew. And I would sit there and spend the day crying. Tears would roll down my cheeks as I let go of the grief that was there from doing that work. But this was my community. This was my home. It still is that group. So that's what I did. Yeah. And then after that, I finally reached the point where I was supposed to retire in 2002. And my mentor, Alan Berkman, who had just spent 8 years in penitentiary for the things that he had done during the Vietnam War, and Jennifer Dorn, sister of Bernadine Dorn, who was one of the founders of SDS, Nancy's boss, and the two of them were in South Africa, and they've got us an invitation that we were to go. We got a note, actually we were in China, an email in August saying you're expected in October. And so that was our start. We went, that was the next 6 years we spent. So that's basically what I've done. Keith, you can poke at me. You know more of my story here.
Not so much more of your story, but for those who have listened to Jens tell stories before, today has been remarkably kind in his description, because he's provided a narrative in chronological order. And usually if you're sitting and talking with him, he'll start to tell a story, and you have to find where in the labyrinth of time it corresponds. And just to illustrate, he hasn't mentioned geography, but from what I can recall, his life moved around the planet quite a bit. So Missouri, Illinois, New York City, Toronto, Ithaca, South Africa, Lesotho, China, and a few other places that pop up now and then. So one of the themes that think, Jen, you were giving thought to was in thinking about discussing your life, ideas that you might want to be able to pass on to some of your grandchildren who you have more limited access to, and they're quite a bit younger than you. So if you wanted to comment at all about the kinds of things you might like your grandchildren to know.
Well, yeah. The world's very different now than it seems when I started, and yet I would like my grandchildren, they're actually adults now, and they're out doing their own, but I've got great grandchildren that are coming up behind. But when I was a broom maker, I was here doing craft fairs in Rochester and Syracuse and various places. And I would have people come up and say, "Oh, wow, I wish I could do that. I wish I could just not have a job of 40 hours a week, pressure and so forth, but I wish I could come out and sit and make brooms and so forth." And I said, "You can." And they looked at me and they didn't know what to do with it. I mean, they had a wife and children, and they had a house, and they had a mortgage, and no, they were bound into the normal way. And so that's what I want to tell my great-grandchildren, is that there isn't a normal way. You get to make your life your own. And I know that my son, when he was a junior in high school, he got a Rotary Fellowship, and he spent a year in Germany. And at the end of the year, he sent a note to his mother saying, "I'm not coming home." And he had made some money making brooms here. And so he had his own money, and he said, "I'm going to spend it going through Europe." And he did. He spent a summer going through Europe. So I think in that respect, he would send me these notes saying, "Don't tell mother." At one point, I know he mentioned that he had been picked up by this woman in a sports car in a convertible, and they had gone off for three days of wild times. He said it was wonderful, but don't tell mother. And he also talked then. But again, he was able to do that. He eventually got tied into an engineering career and with a wife that was disabled. But again, he's now finding his way out and saying, "I don't have to do it the way everybody else does." And I think that's good. Grandchildren, they, of course, had to deal with their parents, their mother, and probably not as open. So it's a way of saying, "Hey, remember, Pops did these things that were different. And you can do them different too. You don't have to go the old way." In fact, one daughter, she got married and then she divorced, and she decided she wanted kids, so she got pregnant. And, she wanted to have a birth at home, but she was couch surfing. And my son said, "If you want to do it at home, you have to have a home." Again, taking a path not the way it normally is. Yeah. Yes.
If you hadn't been in engineering, manufacturing, would you have been able to afford leaving and going to PA school and all of that?
Being an engineer, there was a question of since I was an engineer, that provided me the basis to go to PA school.
You were making money.
I was making lots of money. I was making good money, and I was paying, of course, child support and alimony. And I had a couple of bonds that my grandfather gave me when he died. And I looked at that and I said, that will pay my child support for 6 months or a year. And so then I quit. I knew I could pay that off. And I knew as an engineer I could probably get a job. But then I started making brooms, and so I did that. That was, I made brooms. I would say I went to a craft fair. Well, I think one year I counted them. I went to 26 different craft fairs. So I was out there working up here in the summertime and in Florida during March. I was working hard making brooms, and I would say I was in the poverty level. But I had chosen to give my child support as an engineer, and I maintained that. Luckily, my former wife got married, so I didn't have to pay alimony anymore. But I continued the child support until they finished college, until the one son finished college. Well, so then we went into yes.
So the question concerned how he fared and doing wind chimes in that path.
Again, we did wind chimes, and it was never a major business. I mean, we did a lot. We supported several family groups, and we had made enough for ourselves. We had decided that we were not going to get big. We were not going to be Woodstock chimes. Initially, we were their competitor of them, but they had their chimes made in China, and we weren't going to do that. And so basically, we had enough to survive. And at that point, Nancy was a nurse practitioner, so she also was making some money in addition. And when I went to PA school, she became a midwife. So she went back to school at the same time. But at just about that time, in the period, my mother died, and so there was a little bit of money there, and that supported me. Going to PA school was that. And actually in PA school and being, after I graduated, we had 2 medical incomes. I mean, we had lots of money. We still have lots of money. We don't know how to spend it even. Because we still live very simply. I mean, we built our house. A quarter of the house was existent when I bought this piece of land back in the 60s. But I built one of the rooms myself, and Nancy and I built the other half of the house. And we did that, and we built it because we had the money. We never had a mortgage. We never borrowed any money for that. It was all if we had the money and if we had the time. So and that continued even when we had a goodly amount of money from medical incomes.
Does anyone else have some questions for Jens? Let me pass the microphone to you because that way others can hear.
Jens, I'm curious how you got into the choice in dying area, like helping Camilla's wife, Linda, to die. And I was wondering if your experience with all those HIV patients dying, whether that dying not necessarily in a comfortable way or whatever, having no choice to hasten their death if they had wanted to, whether that influenced your helping Linda and such.
Yeah, I dealt with death. That's what I did. I was aware that my patients, I couldn't cure them. I had no drugs, but I could heal them. And so my patients were not gay white men from downtown. My patients were black who got infected because they shared needles with heroin. And so the idea that this white guy would say, hey, you're a good person, and be there for them was the one thing I could do, and that was healing. So that's where it went. That's what I learned, was to do the healing, to be there with these people. And I had no idea. I did know the ones that were still smoking crack. I mean, it was one of those things. One of the women said, when I smoke crack, I don't remember to take my medicine. Why don't you take the medicine before you smoke crack? Oh, I could do that? That was the sort of thing that I could do. And because when the medicines became available, rather than losing somebody every week, I didn't have a patient die for 3 years. Which also meant that all of a sudden these people who were looking at the fact that they were dying were going to live. And so they were in a change too. How do I do this? You know? I was a druggie, I came in, I was using, was dying. All of a sudden there's this miracle that's coming in and I'm alive. What am I gonna do? And that was difficult, and some of the stories were great. Yeah.
You mentioned being in China and being in South Africa, but what did you do there? That didn't come out yet.
I'm sorry, I missed the...
I said, what did you do when you were in China and in South Africa?
Okay. Well, the China was interesting. Nancy went over to a midwifery conference, and she had worked in New York City, being one of the early hospitals to start giving women AZT who were pregnant and getting to deliver, and that would reduce infection, in fact, mostly eliminate it. So she had that experience, and when she went to this midwifery conference in China, and she spoke about the HIV, and all of the papers from this conference were all translated from English into Chinese, except for the one that she had on HIV. The Chinese government did not recognize that they had HIV. So after we came home, all of a sudden we saw in the New York Times, there was this article of the fact that the Chinese had recognized that they had HIV and that they had let the activists out of prison. And a few weeks later, we got a note from the obstetrician who had been in with Nancy in this conference saying, can you come to China? And so we made 2 trips to China, giving the first HIV lectures along the Yangtze in Shanghai and the various hospitals up there. And so we would go by train up to the next hospital, and they would give us a nice lunch out of good Chinese food, and we'd go and give our talk, and then we would go and get a tour around, and then we would go to dinner, which the heads of the departments would come, and they would all be drinking their stuff, and we didn't drink. We couldn't keep up with them, but having this elaborate Chinese meal. And so we did that, and we did that over 2 trips. And so basically, the lower Yangtze all had treatment. The last place we were was in this brand new hospital in Pudong, which is just across the river from the major part of Shanghai. And the government had said, because of SARS, we went over in the middle of SARS because it was too important. They said no more than 3 people can be gathered any place. And so we went over there, and so they didn't use the auditorium, but they had this very small room that probably had 45 or 50 doctors, wall to wall, because this was their first and only chance to hear about HIV from an expert. And Nancy and I looked at each other and said, you know, that one cough and we would wipe out the hospital. So, but that was the major thing that we did. When we went to Africa, we did some, initially did some research in Durban, which, yeah, it was a wonderful project. We looked at why women didn't test, and we devised that, and it was really interesting. And then there was an election, and the party changed, and they were not interested in it. So all of a sudden, our work was gone. But we found there was this other project in Lesotho that was sponsored by the Clinton Foundation. And we went up and we saw them, and it was this gathering. The people who were running it were young women from America, and the place ran on estrogen. There was not a drop of testosterone there. It was wonderful, the fact that it was run in that way. And so we said, hey, we'll come and we'll go back. So they changed, and they got a new director who was a Basotho doctor. And so we went back, we drove down there to interview her as to whether we would come. And we said, we will come, and we will come for 3 months, which most of the people that came on Clinton Foundation didn't. They were 6 weeks. We come for 3 months, and we will come back. So the government then said, okay, rather than being in the capital or in one of the cities, we're going to send you out into the deepest dark Africa. We went to Lesotho, or to Simonkong, which is at the end of the road. It's about 4 hours about 4 hours travel for 75 miles over rock and rut. And it was the end of the road. There was no road beyond it. There was no 2 tracks. You either walked or you rode a horse. And it was then the community out there. And so we went there. Quite honestly, we went there, and the nurses there at the clinic, we hadn't been told we were coming. And so we arrived with 8 boxes of antiretroviral medicines. And they said, oh, wow, you've come to save our people. And so, not knowing what to do, we started and we trained them. And it was wonderful. Nancy went back a few years later, and there was 2,500 people on treatment. And this is and this was all due from the fact that we taught these people, because we didn't ever see patients. When we were there, we would teach the staff how to do it. And then we went home for 3 months. And so they could figure out what they needed to do themselves, because they were going to do it on their own anyhow. And then we'd come back and say, okay, where are the problems? And we help them sort it out. But the thing was that we did teaching. And that was the thing that was absolutely amazing. And yeah.
Any other questions? It appears to be so. Just a second. Let me.
what did you do about language? And who interpreted it? When you went to the end of the road, did you snag somebody on the way who could translate?
Well, the language, it was interesting because the South Africa and Lesotho were both at one point British colonies. And so the education system was in English. And the medical schools were all in English. And so we would talk with the nurses, and we all spoke English, and they in turn would talk with the Basotho people in their own language. And other than a few basic greetings, we never managed to do it because everybody would speak English to us. We did just one thing that comes out of that, though, is one of the things was language. And you could ask a nurse, what causes AIDS? And she would say, HIV virus that comes, and that causes AIDS. If you ask the same nurse in Basotho language, what causes this illness? She would answer, witchcraft. We were always working across that divide. We were with people who, you know, they were all Christian, except that when the funeral was there, it was all traditional way. The Christianity was about that deep.
Jens and Keith, thanks for doing this. I had a birthday 3 weeks ago, and this is useful for me because I'm much younger than you are. But the thing I'm wrestling with right now is, what's an efficient way to pass this wisdom down 2 or 3 generations? And I'm really thinking about that and starting to look at different techniques, and I'd love to have people that are interested get involved, maybe a little study group. I did a write-up a few years ago on an event of my grandfather in 1917. Really pretty interesting, I thought, a page and a half, and I showed it to a friend of mine my age, and he said, "Are you crazy? None of your grandkids are going to read anything like that." So I said, all right, we need some other mechanism. So I'm really trying to think about what's the media, what's the teaser, so anybody wants to get involved in that, or if you have some ideas.
Well, I think, as I understood it, Fred, you're asking how do we pass that down? That's the real question. And the way I pass it down, and the way Nancy and I pass it down together, because we are very much of the same, is we live it. That's all we can do. We don't have any, wonderful truths to say. But we live it, and we live it, and we acknowledge that we live it. It's one of these things of opening up who we are and what we believe and so forth. And so we decided we're polyamorous, so we each have other relationships, and that's just who we are. This is real, and we try to be real. With our children, with our grandchildren, and but just to, that's all there is. It's who we are. We try to live it.
So, Jens, any thoughts you want to send people away with today? Any thoughts you want to send people away with? Any parting thoughts?
Well, I guess the other things that I'm going to say that I can finish with is the chronology. I started medical school at 57. At 77, I finished my 20 years of HIV. I was in Africa. I said, in Malawi, it was 98 degrees and 98% humidity, and it was mosquito country with malaria. And at 6 o'clock, the electricity went off, so the fans did. So we laid there under the mosquito netting and were cooked. So anyhow, that was 77. And so at 77, my charge went to making money. That was the other piece that I had to do, because I had gotten a little money from my family. Nancy had gotten a little money from hers. We had no retirement, so it was a question then of doing that. And so I spent the next years on the computer working with the stock market, and that was the thing. And so that got me to 77, and I don't know what I'm going to do when I get to 97. That's a big question. I have no idea.
So maybe we'll pause here at the great unknown and thank Jens for his sharing.